So I get the honor of introducing today's speaker, former student from Ripon High School, who I had the pleasure to teach, phenomenal, accomplished pianist, percussionist, and vocalist, and a current student at Lakeland University studying theology. Close enough. Um, let's see. Also a person who I credit to single-handedly revitalizing the Gender and Sexuality Alliance at Ripon High School and to a place where it's currently doing so well. His actual bio, though, Elliott Luedke, they, them, is in their sophomore year at Lakeland University in Plymouth, Wisconsin, majoring in religious studies with a minor in social justice. At Lakeland, Elliott serves as the member for the Mission and Equity Committee, as well as an officer for Alphabet Soup, the on-campus LGBTQ+ support and advocacy group. In addition, they work as the assistant for Lay Chapel and the Ulrich Center for Faith, Ethics, and Justice. Elliott currently serves on the Northeast Placement and Transition Committee for UCC's Wisconsin Conference and will serve as a delegate at the 2025 UCC National Synod.
I first want to thank Kenton for inviting me, and thank you all for having me. I did a similar version of this sermon as it was written this summer, and I rewrote it and edited it to make it a little bit more ecumenical and more so in response to Christian nationalism. We live in a beautiful world in which we are given a wonderful opportunity to foster an inclusive, loving community with each other, regardless of our religious and spiritual beliefs, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, race, and so much more. In essence, we live in a beautiful world because we live in a beautifully diverse world. In spite of this, privileged persons in power are willing to threaten this beautiful diversity. It is scary, and any emotions you hold as you are immersed in this current reality are real and are valid. In whichever way we find possible, however, I call us to fight back against the bigotry and the Christian nationalism that comes with it. And so I ask us to combat this, at least in part, with a theology based on love, inclusion, liberation, and forgiveness. In my experience, the Bible has made me more radically progressive and even more susceptible to the sin of empathy. I'm aware that as a Unitarian Universalist congregation, the Bible is not the only text that reveals sacred truths. Regardless, as I come from a mainline Protestant tradition, I will be using the Bible for most of my justifications against Christian nationalism. I do apologize if this comes across less ecumenical than intended. As this sermon is entitled Love, Liberation, and Forgiveness, it would make sense that I start with love. Alternatively, I will be starting with quite the opposite. In order to respond to Christian nationalism, it is first important to recognize the harm that it causes. Amanda Tyler of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty expressed in 2022 that she believes the single biggest threat to religious freedom in the United States today is Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is antithetical to the constitutional ideal that belonging in American society is not predicated on what faith one practices or whether someone is religious at all. The political ideology that seeks to merge American and Christian identities is deeply embedded in American society and manifests itself in a number of different ways, some more obviously harmful than others, such as what we saw at the January 6th insurrection. And these get the most attention, but the subtle ones, like legislative efforts to promote the teaching of the Bible in public schools, are also dangerous in that they perpetuate the false narrative that to be a true American, one must be Christian, and often a certain type of Christian. Christian nationalism undergirds a number of threats to religious freedom, including anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Semitism, and government-sponsored religion. Nearly 3 years later, this reality of Christian nationalism is deeply and concerningly entrenched in our daily lives. The rhetoric of this ideology has not only justified anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism, but also homophobia, transphobia, and so much more divisive hate. Like many, I am left to wonder, which Christianity do they mean? Certainly, it couldn't be the Christianity that has open and affirming tacked on the doors of its churches. Certainly, it couldn't be the Christianity uplifting the poor and addressing the oppressors. Certainly, it couldn't be the Christianity of our immigrant neighbors, friends, and coworkers. Their version of Christianity is not one founded on the basis of love, liberation, and forgiveness, but rather loses sight of the plethora of messages of inclusion littered throughout the Bible. My goal is not to dismantle Christian nationalism. That would take a long time, and I might actually grow bored of hearing myself speak. But to provide us with a rhetoric that is based on loving inclusion. We can and are able to be louder than bigotry. We live in a perfectly imperfect world. From 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8 and 9, love never fails, prophecies will cease, tongues will be silent, knowledge will pass away. Our knowledge is imperfect, and our prophesying is imperfect. I appreciate this verse as it exemplifies the perfection of love. Whether the existence of God is a reality, it seems that love remains a constant truth. The unwavering love between a parent and child, the connection between a pet and its owner, the love shown at weddings and funerals, it has not shown imperfection. And for me, God is found in all of those. Love transcends the struggles of the oppressed and manifests itself in driving out divisiveness and exclusivity. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. explained it best when he said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." In creating more unconditionally loving spaces, we create more inclusive spaces. By loving without an agenda, we are able to empathize with nearly every aspect of human interaction, thereby fostering safe environments. We live surrounded and entrenched in love, which reaches towards the heavens and stretches beyond our mortal lives. Love itself is as vast and rich as our diverse experiences and identities. Christians are told that it is Yahweh who tamed the chaos of the seas, bringing new, beautiful life, and it was good. It is Yahweh who created us in their image, and we are good just as we are, and who we are yet to become. It is Yahweh who shaped the trees and moved the mountains, and it was good, and is still so rich in Christ's love. The birds created by Yahweh chirp above us and remind us that we may take shelter under the wings of Jesus, the mother hen. We are reminded of Jesus' love as he embraced the full humanity of the woman at the well and his steadfast patience for those who called him Rabbi. Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in loving inclusion, which calls us to join, as Reverend Nadia Bolsweber puts it, the weirdos in the corner. We are called to love all our siblings, which leads me to the second point, liberation. In the Christian and Jewish faiths, we are repeatedly invited to yearn for liberation from a liberating God. Psalm 24 speaks highly of Yahweh as a glorious liberator who makes himself distinctly known as said liberator through the stories of Exodus and beyond. Yahweh chose Moses, who was born into an oppressive Egypt and raised with royal privilege. Moses, a man deeply troubled by the oppression experienced by his enslaved people, was a freeing force through a gracious, liberating God. As Moses split the Red Sea, the chains of oppression have been broken in many other forms through a theology grounded in realizing the humanity of all our siblings. As a Christian, I, like many others, am haunted by a troubled past. Anglo-Protestants were explicitly complicit in using a selective theology to further oppress enslaved African Americans. And yet those who were met with the oppressors who used God's name in vain were the same ones who spoke of Yahweh, the glorious liberator. Enslaved Africans spoke of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt and the civil disobedience of the midwives who defied Pharaoh's orders to execute countless Hebrew infants. Those who were enslaved dreamed of a promised land similar to the enslaved Israelites of Egypt. While we have made strides towards a community which is welcoming and affirms the struggles of every individual, we must always strive towards a more Christ-like world, one filled with unconditional love and justice for the least of these. This liberation is expansive and stretches through nearly every community, region, and nation. Oscar Romero, who served as Archbishop of San Salvador, exemplified the vast opportunity of liberation through Christ. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 31 explains that those who oppress the poor blaspheme their Creator, but to show kindness to the needy is to worship Yahweh. As the El Salvadoran government economically oppressed and physically demeaned the full humanity of its citizens, Romero served as a pillar for those whose voice wasn't heard, acting with unwavering compassion for all of his congregants. Being accused of politicized theology, political and religious elites felt betrayed by him as he took the side of the poor. Romero found God in the oppressed and affirmed their full humanity, sharing, "I don't want to be against anybody. I simply want to be the builder of a great affirmation, the affirmation of a God who loves us and who wants to serve us. We are, as citizens of a nation marred by divisiveness and exclusivity, called to be the builders of a safe, inclusive environment which liberates our siblings from oppression in all its forms. Truly, God calls us to love each other, so may we come as we are and help where we can." Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in his book, Thunder in the Soul, that equality is a good thing, a fine goal may be generally accepted. Seen from the perspective of prophetic faith, the predicament of justice is the predicament of God. Many of us would agree that equality is a good thing. Yet in lives dictated by free will, it is easy for us to remain comfortable in oppressive situations that hurt our neighbors. We are called to seek forgiveness, resulting in a sweeping peace. In chapter 6 of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus blesses the oppressed fairly broadly while also wishing woe upon the privileged. Immediately after this, he calls for loving your enemy, radically restating Old Testament laws of being gracious to your enemy, yet taking it a step further as to call for love. It is important to point out that turning the other cheek does not excuse the oppressive actions of the privileged, but rather ensures that addressing the oppressor is rooted in love. Samantha Gilmore, assistant professor of homiletics at Wartburg Theological Seminary, that's a mouthful, calls us to remember that God did not begin forgiving people when Jesus walked the earth. God has been gracious and merciful from the beginning. This forgiveness presents itself on two levels, individually and communally. I will focus on the communal aspect. We are haunted by our complicity in communal sin, and yet we are told that we are forgiven. This does not mean we are without punishment. Psalm 85 signifies that, as Gilmore points out, forgiveness is an experience of God's steadfast love and faithfulness, reaching through humanity's hardness of heart to soften and turn their hearts toward God. At the time the psalmist was reading Psalm 85, inevitable consequences for present and past actions swept the community. being perceived as God's glory no longer dwelling in their land. And yet we are met with peace. I argue that today we are called to act beyond forgiveness and foster unconditional love, which stretches beyond the bigotry of the oppressor. As the chaos of the world closes in, we still find peace. We are called to rest on the Sabbath and invited to participate in the year of Jubilee, which forgives all debts. May we be filled with overwhelming hope for our mortal and eternal lives as we reconcile the sins of the past and address the oppression of the present. Thank you.